Our scripture comes from the first chapter in Genesis. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness God called night. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. And God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome. And it was so. God called the dome sky, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together God called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruits trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with the seed in it." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed of every kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with the seed in it. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be lights in the domes of the sky to give light upon the earth." And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the night from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the fourth day. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the dome of the sky." So God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves of every kind with which the waters swarm, and every winged bird of every kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas. Let birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning the fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things and wild animals of the earth of every kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals of the earth of every kind, and the cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps upon the ground of every kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth."
And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, kids, just be thankful that your parents aren't ministers, because otherwise they might preach about you someday, and it can be embarrassing. But when my daughter Marin was quite young, she was full of frenetic energy and had this dramatic passion for self-expression. A bit too dramatic, a bit too much. So she basically pushed our buttons a lot, and we found ourselves struggling with three primary ways she liked to express herself that pretty much led us over the proverbial brink at times. I mean, on the surface they weren't so bad. Like, she loved to build forts. I mean, who doesn't like to build forts? Except she would build forts like all over the house, and she would destroy them all over the house and leave them there in their creative destruction. It drove us crazy. Or she would, she loved, I swear, go through 4 or 5 changes of clothing, usually costuming, every single day. And whenever she got tired of being the belly dancer or the Gila monster or the dog or whatever it was, she would just throw that on the floor and go get another costume. Again, 3, 4, 5 times a day doing this. And then there were the animals. Now, Maren had a passion for animals and still does, actually. But when she was young, I mean, the 2 cats just didn't cut it for her. She would go out into our yard in Arizona and look for more pets, so to speak, to bring into the house. Any kind of creepy crawly, flighty whitey, or whatever it was, she wanted to bring that into the house and make it her new best friend pet. And so, in Arizona, you don't want to necessarily bring all those creepy crawlies into the house. So we ended up devoting a great deal of our own energy into trying to tamp down some of Maren's energy, which usually resulted in stern words about not bringing stuff into the house or not cleaning up, and arguments, tear-filled arguments, and even temper tantrums. Sometimes they were hers, sometimes they were ours. But we started getting worried. I mean, if basically left up to Maren's own devices, the house would look like a tornado had just gone through a small city with a zoo and a costume shop in it. We had to put an end to it, but we were worried that the more we tried, we bought books. We bought all those books from child development experts, and they had all kinds of advice, a lot of it contradictory, and we tried every single technique we could that seemed to make sense to us, and nothing was helping. And so slowly we were concerned that she was developing in our mind this persona as the problem child, and that really concerned us. And finally, though, somebody recommended a book that changed everything for us. It was by a maverick psychologist named James Hillman, called The Soul's Code. Now, Hillman, they call him a maverick because he's considered by many of his peers as a maverick, but he's got credentials like being the director of the Carl Jung Institute in Zurich and co-founding the Dallas Institute for Culture and Humanities, things like that. He's got a lot of credibility to him, but he's a maverick because at least in the eyes of his colleagues, because he enters in this book into that classic debate about our development, our personality. Is it created by nature, like our genetics, or nurture, our socialization, how we're brought up? Is it nature or nurture, nature or nurture? Well, Hillman said, well, actually, it's both. But he said, but neither one fully describe what creates our personalities, our persona. He said there's a third thing that is at least as important as the other two. Hillman, as a secular psychiatrist, spoke about soul. He spoke about something that is actually not related to our genetics, that is still hardwired and brought on board with us. That sense of nature, a sense of destiny, a sense of calling, you could say, in Christian parlance. And that's what made things controversial. But he said what changed us, what helped us out, was he said, listen, if you have a child who might be problematic, like, okay, yes, we're waiting. He said oftentimes there are certain children that are born with an unusually strong sense of their destiny, a sense of their calling. They're like an acorn. An acorn has the full coding for the tree it will develop into right in the seed. He said that oftentimes the kids have a sense of that fullness already within them, but they're so young that their brains haven't fully developed. They haven't matured enough to really know what those impulses are doing. And so oftentimes they just simply act out in ways to kind of work on these impulses, but they may not be always productive. He said, so pay attention to the way your child acts out. See if you can find the underlying theme under these actions, and see if maybe you wonder about, well, what impulse is that child working off of that might be a calling for him or her? Maybe if you can kind of discern what that might be, you can actually create new forms of behavior, route that energy into a positive direction rather than a negative one. So, he gives us an example, many examples in the book, but one I'll mention of this child named Elias Canetti. Elias was born in Bulgaria in 1905, And he was fascinated from the earliest times he can remember with writing. At first, he didn't even know what writing was. All he knew was his dad could sit down at the breakfast table, pick up a newspaper, and silently then derive all kinds of information from it without anybody talking. And he was like, whoa, how did that happen? And he thought it was the smell of the paper. So he would get up on his father's lap and try to smell the paper and get the information his father was getting. And then later, his cousin, who was just a couple years older than him, was learning to write and would come over for writing exercises at their house. And he thought, oh, okay, this is how it works. You put information on a page, and then somehow you get it from these symbols. And so he always wanted to, like, reach for her notebooks and try to figure this writing thing out. And, of course, being a couple years older, she would like, no, these are mine, not yours. And sometimes she might even taunt him. You know, oh, here, no. Because he was crazy for these notebooks. Well, one day, he wanted the cousin's notebook, and the cousin, refused to hand it over, and so he ended up chasing her all around the house with it, and finally she just put it up on a shelf that was too high for him to reach. Well, at that, he did something that the family remembered for the rest of their days. He stomped out into the yard, found the family axe, picked it up, went inside, shouting, now I'm going to kill Lorica. Now I'm going to kill Lorica. Now, can you imagine this happening today? What would be the fate of that child? I mean, certainly heavy medication, hours on a psychiatrist's couch, probably maybe even institutionalized. I don't know. But this Elias Canetti did not have any of these happen. And he grew up to win the new Nobel Peace Prize in literature. Acting on these impulses, but not knowing how to control that energy as a young child. So, Melanie and I, when we read all this, I'll admit we were a bit skeptical at first, but we were at wit's end. we'd run out of alternatives. So we thought, okay, well, Marin's maybe those costume changes. Maybe that's a symbol, a sign that she's maybe got a future in design or fashion or acting or something. So maybe instead of just saying you can't put on costumes, we could say you can put on costumes, as many as you want, but you have to put away your costume before you take out the next one. And we even told her, you've always wanted to wear these costumes around, like to church and stuff. We'll even let you do that, provided you follow the rule. The next time you want a new costume, you have to put the old one away. So she literally would come to church at times dressed as a dog or as an Indian princess. A little awkward for us, but we were letting Marin be Marin, and the church people actually were surprisingly good with it. So we did that. And then there was that whole building thing. So we thought, well, maybe that's a sign that she's meant to go into like construction or engineering or architecture or something. So we said, okay, you can build all the forts you want, but you can't build them all over the house. You need to keep them in your room, and you can build them, tear them down to your heart's content. And so there was that. And then you got the animal thing. Well, we weren't about to let all the creepy crawlies in the world into our house, at least not contained. So we said, I'll tell you what, we provided a special jar with air holes in the top. We said, if you want to bring a little friend home inside the house, you bring it home inside the house with this. And so she would use the container. And she got kind of good at this. And she actually ended up creating her own little containers. One day, she brought a bird inside the house that had been hurt, a little bird, a young bird that had fallen out of the nest, apparently been abandoned and was injured. And gosh, I wish she wrote 2 pages of instructions to us about how to help her take care of Kirby, her new friend. I so wish I could share it with you. It was hilarious. Oh, wait a minute. Maybe I can. At least a snippet. Get a load of this. Worms are in their fridge on top of the vegetable crisper in blue containers. Feed her 3 times a day at least. Wipe most of the dirt off each worm. Early in the morning is best. She'll be hungriest at this time, so give her about 7 to 8 worms. She tends to open her mouth like a young chick for the mother to drop the food in, and I'm trying to get her out of the habit. So make her take it in your hand. She's a good bird. Note, if you swat a fly or bug in the house, you can give that to her and she'll eat that too. She's kind of handy that way. This is just a small excerpt of 2 full pages for Kirby. So anyway, we put all that into motion, just looking for how do we route the energy into creative ways rather than just simply trying to repress it or thwart it. And you know what happened? Those arguments went away. I mean, it was amazing. Almost overnight, there's this huge shift. No more temper tantrums, no arguments and crying and all this, and we were far happier, and it stayed that way for the rest of her days. Not that we never got in an argument, but not arguments like that. And so I don't think it's a coincidental that Marin then would grow up. When she came to Omaha, she got involved in the zoo as a volunteer and taking classes there. She eventually earned a degree, a bachelor's in biology. She earned a master's in architecture, and in fact is in Denver now looking for jobs. If anybody has a lead, just let me know and I'll pass that on. And her special interest in architecture is developing in the field of what they call biomimicry, which is a cutting-edge part of the field is looking at nature and the efficiencies of nature to create then into efficiencies of design for sustainable design. All that right there. And Marin is, to this day, the most fashionable dresser that Melanie and I know. So I don't know, do all children have a soul's code, a sense of call that they're acting out? I suspect they do. But what I really know for sure is that Marin certainly has her code, her soul's calling.
From the 5th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter, will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven.
One of the greatest gifts that Judaism brings us is the Torah. That's the first 5 books of the Jewish and Christian scriptures, from Genesis to Deuteronomy. And the center point of the Torah is those 10 commandments that are said to have been given to Moses himself on Mount Sinai. What we outside of Judaism often don't realize is that in addition to those 10 commandments, there are another 603 in the Torah. 613 commandments, laws, rules, statutes, ordinances, those kind of things to govern everyday life. And now we don't necessarily think of all these rules as gifts. As Christians, we are brought up to be skeptical of the law. We create this dichotomy between law, that's the Old Testament, and there's grace in the New Testament. So we tend to be suspicious of too many rules. I mean, didn't Paul himself say, the letter kills, that is the law, but the Spirit gives life. So we tend to think of laws as being repressive, not expansive. We tend to see them as death-dealing, not life-giving. We tend to think of laws as being even tyrannical, not helping free people from bondage. I mean, didn't we just celebrate a holiday where we celebrate our independence from tyranny and all, laws that shouldn't be applying to us and so forth? We want freedom from the law. But our Jewish and Muslim friends, they both are full of laws and rules to follow, and they encourage us to think a little differently, not be so oversimplistic in our dichotomizing between grace and law. In fact, they would say that actually the law is a form of grace and love. And the more interaction I have with these communities here, too, the more I find, there's really something to that. I mean, what if God's laws are kind of like, operate like James Hillman would advise us to, of how we apply them with our children? They're not meant to repress impulse. They're actually meant to expand and extend impulse in a productive direction. They are not meant to be arbitrary, but they're meant to be actually carefully crafted to bring us life and into relationship that's productive and sustainable with one another. What if the laws are like this? Now certainly laws can become, I'm not going to stand here and defend every law in Judaism or Islam or even Christianity as if they're all good. I mean, certainly we know there's a negative side to focusing on laws and rules and regulations. It's called legalism. And we know Jesus came into a time within Judaism where that life-bearing nature of law practice seemed to have been eclipsed by quite a lot of legalism. So Jesus told parables about like a prodigal child who broke every law in the book and yet then returns to his father's grace and welcome then in the end. Or in embodied actions, Jesus showed us you can hang out with the classic bad three, the prostitutes, tax collectors, and sinners. I mean, he spent time with these people continually, showing that in every way showing us that in any competition between law and love wins. Love wins because God is a gracious God. But he did not say that I come to abolish the law, right? He said I came to fulfill the law. The law is still operating, only Jesus, I think, saw the law like James Hillman would see it. It's meant to route our energies, route our human impulses into more productive ways. So how do we, what can we glean from this gift that Judaism brings us of the Torah, or of a spiritual practice of following the law? Well, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that when the Torah came into the world, it revolutionized the world. I mean, it really created a revolution. You had, basically before then, you had a whole lot of chaotic ways of life, and Judaism brought order to that way of life, and a specific order that was built on a foundation, a bedrock of an intuition that we are all created in the image and likeness of God, that all people, therefore, are connected to God. All people are loved. Now, other traditions, other religions around them also had a sense that we are connected to the divine, but only the rulers, or only the wealthy, not the everyday person. So Judaism comes and says, no, it's everybody, and so it comes up with rules and regulations in order to then acknowledge that we are all loved beyond our wildest imagination, not just some. So how do you then order an entire way of life that is built on that recognition? That's what the Torah did. Its legacy is with us today. But now, if you really want to understand the tickings and you want to see how this is all supposed to work, actually you can look to Deuteronomy where the Ten Commandments are given and these other rules, or Exodus where there's a lot of rules, or Leviticus where there's a lot of rules. But I recommend just opening up your Bible to Genesis 1, verse 1. Right there in chapter 1, it really, the whole creation story is meant, I think, not simply to tell us about some scientific version of what creation is all about, but it's actually there at the very beginning of the Bible to show us how the Torah is those rules are meant to be worked out in everyday life. So if you look at Genesis, and we heard that opening chapter, we tend to focus on God's strong command. Let there be light, and there's light. Bam! God creates something from nothing. That's pretty impressive. That's powerful. But most of God's creation is not this way. It's not by direct command like this. Rather, if you were listening carefully, you learned that there was something that was said to exist before God said, "Let there be light." This watery, formless chaos, this sea of unactualized possibility. You could say potentiality. It was all this chaos. God does not, once God turns on the lights on this whole thing, then creation takes a very different form than we expect. It's not through direct fiat, let's create something from nothing. No, God actually sets rules for the chaos that allow the chaos, the unactualized possibilities, to emerge into form and structure. So God says, let's separate the waters above from the waters below. They thought that there was water up there, that's why the sky's blue, and there's water underneath us. Let us separate those waters and create then airspace and let the dry land emerge. So God creates these rules for how chaos can be ordered. And so that's one way God creates, is simply through creating these order in chaos. The second way God creates is once the dry land emerges, God then says, God does not say, let there be vegetation, let there be animals. God says, let the earth produce vegetation. God is empowering the earth to be a co-creator with God. Let the earth create the animals, right? Let the seas produce fish. So God is creating through empowering God's very creation. That's another way that God works. And then finally, God empowers God's creations to become co-creators. God's creations who will become now co-creators, to even allow their creations to become co-creators. Because let the trees be fruitful and multiply. Let the animals be fruitful and multiply. Let human beings be fruitful and multiply. So God it's really about empowering creation to become its fullest self. And in the end, it's operating so beautifully that on the seventh day, God doesn't have to do a thing. It's all existing in mutually interdependent relationships that produce life peacefully and sustainably. It's all working perfectly like that, indicating that really the laws, those rules that God sets up are meant to do the same thing. So when God says, let the human beings have dominion over the earth, there's the problematic piece, right? We think that means just do whatever the heck you want. It's yours. Destroy it, do whatever. No, that's about exercising dominion as God would exercise dominion, creating rules, processes, laws that help keep us in mutually interdependent, fruitful, productive relationship such that life is being promoted, such that people's destiny and calling, even the earth's destiny and calling, is realized. In other words, rules and processes that result in extinction of species and drought and famine caused by climate change and so forth are anything but godly rules. So that's how creation shows us the nature of rules themselves. They're meant to produce life. They're meant to expand life. They're meant to take those impulses that we all have because we are created in the image and likeness of God, which is a pretty strong impulse that our little brains can't quite process fully, so that could sometimes end up in unproductive behavior and just kind of adjust them into more productive directions. So, really, if Melanie and I had been reading Genesis 1 a little more closely than when we had Marin at the beginning of her life, read more about the beginning of the world, we might have actually gleaned the very same principles that Hillman gave us in his book, although we are very grateful for James Hillman for pointing out what we overlooked in Genesis. That chaos may not necessarily be negative. In fact, usually chaos is not negative. Chaos is unactualized potential that yearns to fulfill its destiny. Chaos is an invitation then to find the ways through it to then allow that energy to work to be productive and to be in relationship with others. So I want to bring this to a close by just asking ourselves to consider the chaos that we're experiencing in today's world. The breakdown of social order and economic order and political orders and so forth. I mean, we see that as a really, really bad thing, and in certain cases it definitely is. But need this chaos be entirely negative? Or could this chaos that we're experiencing actually be invitational in nature? Actually be an opportunity to relook at those rules and ways of life that we've established that may no longer be working, that they may not be producing life and love and grace. I mean, Jesus even said, we continually say, you have heard it said before, but now I say to you. Maybe there's adjustments that need to be made. Maybe the chaos we're experiencing today is our opportunity to be co-creators with God of new ways of life, new rules, new ways of interacting with each other and with the planet, helping God build a new world where the law of love is not simply written on a page, but in the human heart. Amen. And we remember on the night of betrayal and desertion, Jesus shows us another way that chaos